Blood has a distinct copper smell that doesn't wash out of linen easily. Maeve knew this because she spent 3 nights a week scrubbing it from the cuffs of men who owned the city. She didn't ask questions. You don't survive in a house like this by being curious. You survive by being invisible. But invisibility is a fragile armor, and when the man who pays your wages finally decides to really see you, there is nowhere left to hide. The Moretti estate did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress built by someone who had forgotten how to sleep. Set back from the coastal highway behind 3 acres of dense, wet pines and an 8-foot wrought iron fence, the house was all gray stone and high, drafty windows. It was always cold inside. The radiators hissed and clanked in the winter, a dry, metallic rattle that sounded like a dying man's lungs, but the chill never really left the hallway floors. Maeve Miller wore thick wool socks inside her black work shoes to keep her toes from going numb while she polished the banisters. She was 26 years old, and for the last 14 months, her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this house. 3 floors, 32 rooms, 18 toilets that needed scrubbing with bleach that burned the lining of her nostrils. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because her older brother, Dean, had a fondness for poker tables and basement clubs and a catastrophic inability to calculate odds. When Dean had vanished to Florida, or Mexico, or a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens, no one really knew. He had left behind $40,000 in unpaid debt to Callum Moretti. Callum was not a man who wrote off debts. He was a businessman who traded in leverage. He had taken one look at Maeve's cramped studio apartment, her stack of past-due bills, and the defiant, exhausted glare she gave him from her doorway, and he had offered her a job, live-in housekeeping, room, board, and $50 a week for incidentals. Every other dollar she earned went directly against Dean's ledger. You work hard, you keep your mouth shut, and in 3 years you're a free woman, Callum had told her that night. His voice was like coarse gravel turned over with a shovel. Flat, void of malice, void of anything at all. Maeve had taken the job because the alternative was a broken jaw or a bullet in the knee, and she liked walking without a limp. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly. The low, rumbling engines of armored sedans pulling into the gravel drive at 2 in the morning. The heavy thud of boots on the back stairs. The smell of expensive Cuban cigars, stale espresso, and gun oil that clung to the leather sofas in the study. She learned which men to avoid entirely, like Paulie, who had dead, watery eyes and always lingered too close to the kitchen door, and which one simply ignored her existence. Callum ignored her. For over a year, she was nothing more than the pair of hands that replaced the fresh towels in his master suite. The shadow that cleared the empty tumblers of scotch from his desk while he stared out the window at the rain. He was 34, but he carried the posture of an old man who had been carrying sacks of wet cement his entire life. Broad-shouldered, always dressed in dark, impeccably tailored wool suits that smelled faintly of cedar and rain, he had a sharp, angled jaw covered in a perpetual 2-day stubble. His eyes were the color of wet slate. When he looked at a room, he didn't see the decor. He saw the exits, the blind spots, and the structural weaknesses. Maeve did not romanticize him. She had read the paperback novels some of the younger maids passed around, stories about misunderstood mobsters with hearts of gold who just needed the love of a good woman to leave the life. It was garbage. Callum Moretti was a predator. He ordered beatings over morning coffee. He ruined families with the stroke of a pen. The fact that he chewed with his mouth closed and wore imported cologne didn't change what he was. Yet, as she stood in the doorway of his study on a late Tuesday evening, holding a silver tray with a fresh pot of black coffee, she noticed the slight tremor in his right hand as he reached for a pen. He was human. That was the dangerous realization. A monster you can predict. A tired, desperate human being is capable of anything. "Set it on the corner," he said. He didn't look up from the ledger in front of him. Maeve crossed the Persian rug, her shoes making no sound. She placed the tray down, the porcelain clinking softly against the silver. The air in the room was thick with the scent of burning logs from the fireplace and the sharp, acidic tang of stress sweat. She turned to leave, her eyes dropping instinctively to the floor to avoid lingering. "Wait," Callum said. Maeve stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She felt her stomach tighten, a cold drop of adrenaline hitting her gut. Did I break something? Was the coffee too weak? Did Dean do something stupid again? She turned slowly, keeping her hands folded in front of her white apron. "Yes, Mr. Moretti." He was leaning back in his leather chair now, rubbing the bridge of his nose with two thumb and forefinger. His eyes were closed. The harsh overhead reading lamp cast deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. He looked gray. "There's a stain on the rug in the formal dining room," he said, his voice flat, exhausted. "Near the baseboard by the east window. I'll take care of it first thing in the morning, sir. Do it now." He opened his eyes. They locked onto hers, slate gray, heavy with a weight she couldn't name. "Use cold water. Don't use the bleach. It ruins the fibers." "Yes, sir." She didn't ask what the stain was. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, turned on her heel, and walked out into the drafty hallway, her heart hammering a steady, cynical rhythm against her ribs. Just 2 more years, she told herself as she headed to the basement for the bucket. 2 more years, and I never have to smell blood again. The stain in the dining room wasn't large, but it was dark and sticky, soaking into the intricate cream and crimson weave of the antique rug. Maeve knelt on the cold hardwood, her knees aching, scrubbing rhythmically with a stiff-bristled brush and a bowl of ice-cold water. Scrub, blot, rinse, repeat. She kept her mind blank. It was a survival technique she had perfected during her first month. If she thought about whose blood it might be, whether it belonged to a rival who had talked too loud, or one of Callum's own men who had dipped his fingers into the weekly collection, she would throw up. And if she threw up on the rug, she would have to clean that too. A shadow fell over the floorboards. Maeve didn't flinch. She had heard the heavy, even footsteps approaching from the hallway, but she hadn't expected him to stop. Callum stood in the arched doorway of the dining room. He had taken off his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing thick, corded muscle and a faded, jagged scar that ran from his left wrist halfway up to his elbow. He was holding a glass of scotch, the ice cubes clanking softly against the crystal as he swayed slightly. Not drunk, just unsteady from the sheer weight of gravity. "You're doing it wrong," he said. Maeve stopped scrubbing, her hands dripping icy, pink-tinted water back into the bowl. She looked up at him, keeping her expression blank. "I'm doing what you said, Mr. Moretti. Cold water, blotting from the outside in." He stared at her for a long moment. It was the longest he had ever looked at her without looking through her. He took a slow sip of his drink, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. "Give me the towel," he ordered, stepping into the room. Maeve blinked. "Sir? Give me the damn towel, Maeve." He knew her name. He had never used her name before. It had always been you, or girl, or a simple nod of the chin. Hearing it in his raspy, late-night voice felt like a trespass, a violation of the professional distance that kept her safe. She handed him the clean rag. To her shock, Callum Moretti, the man who controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the state, dropped to one knee beside her on the floor. He set his glass of scotch down on the sideboard and took the rag, dipping it into the bowl of pink water. "You have to press down," he murmured, his shoulder brushing against hers. The scent of him, cedar, tobacco, and the sharp bite of alcohol, was suffocatingly close. If you just scrub the surface, the stain sets at the root of the wool. You have to push the cold water down into the weave and let the rag absorb it from underneath. He demonstrated, his large calloused hand pressing the damp rag hard into the carpet, his knuckles whitening with the force. When he lifted it, the dark spot on the rug was visibly lighter. "Where did you learn how to clean Persian rugs, Mr. Moretti?" Maeve asked. The words were out of her mouth before her brain could stop them. It was a stupid risk. A cynical woman shouldn't get chatty with a butcher. Callum didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the crimson pattern of the wool. "My mother," he said quietly. "She spent half her life cleaning up messes my father brought into the house. She taught me how to get the wine out. And the other stuff. Sounds like a hard life." He paused, the rag hovering over the bowl. He turned his head slowly. At this distance, Maeve could see the fine red lines threading through the whites of his eyes, the dark purple bruises of exhaustion beneath them. There was no anger in his face, only a dry, hollow amusement that didn't reach his mouth. "It was a terrible life," he said. "She died when I was 16. Heart gave out. I think she just got tired of wringing out the rags." Maeve felt a strange, unwelcome tug in her chest. Not pity. Pity was a luxury she couldn't afford, but a cold, absolute recognition. She knew what it was like to be trapped by the debts of the men in your family. She knew the exhaustion of scrubbing someone else's grime off your hands every night. "I can finish this, sir," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the stiff, subservient polish she usually wore around him. "You pay me to clean the floors. You shouldn't be on your knees." Callum looked at her hand, which was resting on the rim of the water bowl. Her skin was raw, red from the icy water, the nails cut short and unadorned. He reached out, his thumb lightly grazing the side of her wrist. Maeve froze. Her breath caught in her throat. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the numbing cold of the water on her hands. "Why don't you ever cry?" he asked softly. "What?" "The other girls," he said, his thumb still resting against her pulse point, feeling the rapid, trapped bird flutter of her heart. "The ones who come here to work off debts, or because they have nowhere else to go. They cry in the laundry room. They tremble when I walk past them. You don't." Maeve pulled her hand back, slow enough not to seem like she was fleeing, but firm enough to break the contact. She picked up the stiff brush again. "Crying takes water, Mr. Moretti," she said, looking down at the stain. "And it makes your eyes swell up so you can't see what's coming. I can't afford to be blind." Callum stared at her bowed head for a long, quiet half-minute. The only sound in the room was the steady swish-swish of her brush against the wool. Finally, he reached out, picked up his glass of scotch from the sideboard, and stood up, his joints popping slightly in the cold air. "Make sure you lock the kitchen door when you're done," he said, his voice back to its usual flat command room gravel. "Frank Russo is coming over tomorrow for lunch. The house is going to be crowded. Stay in the back." "Yes, sir." He walked away, his footsteps fading down the long hallway toward the stairs. Maeve sat back on her heels, staring at the spot on the rug where his knee had pressed into the pile. Her wrist still burned where his thumb had touched her. She wiped her hand on her apron, cursing herself for the sudden, erratic thumping in her chest. "He's just a man," she reminded herself fiercely. "A lonely, dangerous man who is bored." "Don't be an idiot, Maeve." The next day, the Moretti estate smelled of roasted garlic, rosemary, and tension so thick you could choke on it. Frank Russo was a captain from the North End, a stout, red-faced man with a loud laugh and cold, reptilian eyes who had been a business partner of Callum's father. He brought 6 bodyguards with him. They stood in the hallways like dark, ill-fitting furniture, their hands buried deep in their coat pockets, chewing gum and watching the staff with casual hostility. Maeve spent the morning in the kitchen, helping Teresa, the elderly cook, plate the roasted veal and slice the crusty Italian bread. Teresa was 70, deaf in her left ear, and possessed a survival instinct honed over 40 years of working for organized crime. "Don't look at them," Teresa muttered, slamming a heavy cast-iron pan into the sink. "When you serve the wine, look at the tablecloth. If they say a joke, don't laugh. If they touch your skirt, break a plate so Mr. Callum hears it. He don't like animals in his dining room." "I know how to handle myself, Teresa," Maeve said, smoothing down her black apron. "No, you don't," the old woman snapped, turning a rheumy, discerning eye on Maeve. "You got pride, girl. I see it in how you walk. Pride is a luxury item. You bring it into that dining room today, one of those bastards is going to try to buy it off you or break it over his knee. Head down, pour the wine, get out." Maeve didn't argue. She knew Teresa was right. But knowing the rules and enjoying them were 2 different things. At 1 o'clock, she carried the heavy silver tray of wine decanters into the formal dining room. The atmosphere inside was suffocating. The air conditioner was running, but the room was hot with the body heat of 8 heavy-set men and the pungent aroma of rich food and expensive cologne. Callum sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore a dark navy suit today, his tie knotted tightly at his throat. He looked entirely in element, calm, watchful, his hands resting flat on the polished wood as Frank Russo leaned across the table, waving a fork for emphasis. "I'm just saying, Callum, the union delegates are getting twitchy," Frank was saying, his voice a coarse rasp that filled the room. "Your old man, God rest his soul, he knew how to throw the dogs a bone. You've been tightening the leash too much. People can't breathe." "They're breathing fine, Frank," Callum said quietly. His voice didn't rise above a conversational murmur, but the instant he spoke, Frank stopped waving his fork. "They're getting paid 20% above market rate for the harbor contracts. If they're twitchy, it's because someone is whispering in their ears, telling them they should be asking for 30. Frank chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Nobody's whispering, kid. It's just simple math. Cost of living is going up." Maeve approached the table from the right side, stepping neatly between Frank and one of his lieutenants, a burly man with a broken nose named Dominic. She lifted the crystal decanter of Barolo, her hand steady, and began to pour into Frank's glass. "Hey," Frank said, his eyes leaving Callum to drift up Maeve's arm, lingering on the line of her throat before settling on her face. "Who's this? This a new girl, Callum? What happened to the little blonde with the stutter?" "She left," Callum said. His eyes didn't move from Frank's face. "Eat your veal, Frank." Frank didn't eat. He leaned back in his chair, blocking Maeve's path back toward the sideboard. He reached out, his thick, hairy fingers wrapping around her wrist as she tried to pull the decanter away. "Not so fast, sweetheart," Frank grinned, his breath smelling of garlic and stale tobacco. "Pour a little more. You got a steady hand. I like a girl with a steady hand. What's your name?" Maeve froze. The silence in the room dropped like a lead weight. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. She looked down at Frank's hand on her wrist. The pressure was firm, borderline painful, a clear display of dominance meant entirely for Callum's benefit. "Look at the tablecloth," Teresa's voice echoed in her head. "Don't look at them." Maeve didn't look at the tablecloth. She looked straight down into Frank Russo's bloodshot eyes. Her face was a mask of cold, polite detachment, but her jaw was set like granite. "My name is Maeve, sir," she said, her voice clear and level. "And if you don't let go of my arm, I'm going to spill $40 wine all over your $1,000 suit." Dominic let out a low whistle. Frank's smile vanished, his face darkening to an ugly, congested purple. His fingers tightened on her wrist, hard enough to grind the bones together. Maeve didn't wince. She just stared at him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of pain. "You got a loud mouth for a maid," Frank snarled, his voice dropping into a register that promised violence. "Maybe I ought to teach you how to address your betters." "Frank." The single word cut through the heavy air like a razor blade through silk. Callum hasn't raised his voice. He hadn't even shifted in his chair. But his hands were no longer resting flat on the table. His right hand was curled into a fist, his knuckles stark white against the dark mahogany. His slate-gray eyes were locked onto Frank with a cold, terrifying intensity that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Let go of my staff," Callum said. "Callum, come on. She's disrespecting—" "I said," Callum repeated, his voice dropping an octave, quieter now, almost a whisper. "Let go of her arm, right now, or you don't leave this table with that hand." The bodyguards in the corners of the room shifted, hands slipping toward their waistbands. In the same heartbeat, the two men standing behind Callum moved a half-step forward, their jackets falling open to reveal the grips of their holstered automatics. The room was balanced on a razor's edge, ready to tip into a bloodbath over a spilled glass of wine and a maid's pride. Frank stared at Callum for 3 long, agonizing seconds. He was calculating the odds, weighing the cost of his pride against the look in the young boss's eyes. Slowly, with an exaggerated shrug and a greasy smirk, he uncurled his fingers and released Maeve's wrist. "Just playing with the help, kid," Frank chuckled, picking up his fork again. "You got a tight ass about everything lately. You need to relax." Maeve didn't wait for permission. She stepped back, clutching the decanter to her chest, her wrist throbbing where his red fingerprints were already rising on her pale skin. She didn't look at Callum. She turned and walked out of the dining room with measured, even steps, refusing to run, refusing to show them that her knees were shaking so badly she could barely stand. When When the kitchen door swung shut behind her, she leaned her back against the cool tiles and let out a long, ragged breath. Her eyes closed. "I told you," Teresa whispered from the stove, not looking over her shoulder. Her voice was trembling slightly. "I told you to leave your pride in the basement." "He touched me," Maeve whispered, looking down at her bruised wrist. "They all touch," Teresa hissed, turning around with tears of frustration in her old eyes. "They touch, they take, they break. You don't challenge them, Maeve. You think Mr. Callum saved you because he cares about you? He did it because Frank was insulting his house. You're just a piece of furniture they're arguing over." Maeve opened her mouth to reply, but the words died in her throat. Deep down, she knew Teresa was right. It wasn't about her. It was about territorial dominance. Men like Callum Moretti didn't fight for women. They fought for property. And yet, as she rubbed her aching wrist under the cold kitchen faucet, she couldn't forget the look in Callum's eyes just before Frank had let her go. It hadn't been the cool, calculating gaze of a businessman protecting an investment. It had been rage, raw, murderous, and entirely human. The lunch meeting ended 3 hours later without gunfire, though the silence that followed Frank Russo's departure was heavier than before. The armored sedans crunched over the wet gravel of the driveway, carrying the North End men back to their territories, leaving behind a trail of cigar ash and unspoken declarations of war. Maeve spent the afternoon scrubbing the kitchen and organizing the pantry, keeping her head down. By 7 o'clock, the house was eerily quiet. The bodyguards had retired to the outer gatehouses or the basement security room. The kitchen staff had gone home for the night, leaving Maeve alone with the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the dreary, incessant drumming of the rain against the glass. She was wiping down the stainless steel prep counters when the intercom on the wall buzzed. A red light blinked below the label marked "Study." Maeve stared at it for a moment, her bruised wrist pulsing with a dull ache. She wiped her hands on a dry towel, took a deep breath to steady her nerves, and pushed through the swinging doors into the shadowed interior of the house. The study door was cracked open an inch. A thin slice of amber light spilled out onto the dark hallway floor. Maeve knocked lightly on the heavy oak. "Come in," Callum's voice called out. He sounded exhausted, as though speaking required more energy than he had left to give. Maeve pushed the door open and stepped inside, stopping 2 feet from the threshold with her hands clasped in front of her apron. "You rang, sir?" Callum was standing by the large bay window, looking out into the pitch-black woods. The room was dim, illuminated only by the dying embers in the fireplace and the green-shaded banker's lamp on his desk. He had discarded his suit jacket again. His tie was loosened, hanging around his neck like a noose. On the sideboard, a fresh bottle of scotch stood beside an empty glass. He wasn't drinking. He was just holding a silver cigarette case, turning it over and over in his hands. "How is your arm?" he asked without turning around. "It's fine, sir, just a little sore." "Let me see it." Maeve hesitated. Her instinct, honed by years of dealing with a deadbeat brother and the rough men he associated with, was to retreat, to say it was nothing, to keep the armor up. But there was something in Callum's tone that wasn't a command. It sounded almost like a request. She walked across the Persian rug, the same rug she had cleaned the night before, now spotless, and stopped a few feet behind him. She held out her left arm, pulling back the stiff cuff of her white shirt. Callum turned slowly. His eyes dropped to her wrist. The bruises had blossomed into an ugly, mottled pattern of deep purple and red, the distinct imprint of Frank Russo's thick fingers branded into her skin. Callum's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched in his cheek, his teeth grinding together in the quiet room. He reached out, his movements incredibly slow, as if he were afraid she would bolt if he moved too fast. His large, warm fingers wrapped gently around her forearm, just below the bruises, supporting her arm in the air as he examined the marks. "I should have killed him at the table," Callum murmured, his voice barely audible above the crackle of the fireplace. "I should have put a bullet in his throat the second he put his hands on you." "That would have been bad for business, sir," Maeve said, trying to keep her voice light, cynical. "Teresa says Frank controls the union delegates. You don't start a war over a housekeeper." Callum's eyes snapped up from her wrist to her face. The slate gray of his irises was dark, stormy, stripped of its usual professional detachment. He didn't let go of her arm. If anything, his grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to anchor her in place. "Do you think that's all you are to me?" he asked. "A piece of staff? An item on a ledger?" Maeve felt the familiar, protective walls of her cynicism rising up. She looked at him, refusing to let him soften the reality of their situation. "I am a $40,000 debt, Mr. Moretti. I am here because my brother is a thief and an idiot, and because you needed someone to scrub the baseboards and serve the wine. Let's not pretend this is anything else. It's safer if we don't." "Safer for who?" "For me," she said, her voice trembling just a fraction, betraying the calm facade she was fighting to maintain. "When men like you start looking at women like me as anything more than furniture, it usually ends with the woman in a ditch or crying in a laundry room. I told you yesterday, I can't afford to be blind." Callum stepped closer to her. The physical distance between them evaporated. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, could smell the rain on his shirt and the faint, bitter tang of the tobacco he hadn't smoked. He was so much larger than her, casting a shadow that completely swallowed her up in the dimly lit room. "You think I want to hurt you?" he asked, his voice a rough, low scrape against the quiet. "I think you hurt everyone around you, whether you mean to or not," Maeve said honestly, looking up into his face. "It's your job. It's the air you breathe in this house. Everything here is built on violence, Callum." She hadn't meant to use his first name. It slipped out, raw and familiar, a sudden intimacy that hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Callum didn't flinch at the familiarity. Instead, his shoulder dropped slightly, the rigid military posture of the Mafia boss dissolving for a brief, dangerous second. He looked at her not with anger, but with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that mirrored her own. "You're right," he whispered. "Everything I touch turns to blood or ashes. I live in a house full of men who would put a knife in my back for a 5% increase in their territory. I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night since my father was buried." He lifted his free hand. His fingers hovered in the air for a second, hesitating before he gently touched the side of her face. His calloused thumb brushed against her cheekbone, tracing the line of her skin with a reverence that felt entirely out of place in this cold, fortified house. Maeve stopped breathing. Her instinct screamed at her to pull away, to run back to the safety of the kitchen, to hide behind her mop and her bucket and her cynical detachment. But her feet wouldn't move. Her skin burned where his fingers touched her, a sudden, desperate warmth that bypassed her armor entirely. "You are the only person in this entire city who doesn't lie to me, Maeve," Callum said, his eyes searching hers in the amber gloom. "You don't smile when you hate me. You don't cower when you're afraid. You just stand there and look at me like I'm a human being." "You are a human being," she whispered, her voice husky, stripped of its sarcasm. "That's what makes you so terrifying." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 10 times, a soft, metallic ringing that seemed to vibrate through the heavy silence of the study. Neither of them moved. Callum's hand was still cupping the side of her face, his thumb resting near the corner of her mouth. Maeve's left arm was still cradled in his other hand, the bruised skin of her wrist contrasting sharply with the pale cuffs of his shirt. She should tell him to stop. She should remind him of the debt, of the professional distance, of Teresa's warnings about men who break what they touch. She had survived 26 years in a harsh, unforgiving world by expecting the worst from people, especially men with power. She knew how this story was supposed to end. But looking up at him now, seeing the unguarded misery in his eyes, the heavy dark circles of sleeplessness, the slight nervous tension in his jaw, her cynicism failed her. It cracked down the middle, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and terrifyingly alive. She dropped her gaze to his collarbone, unable to sustain the intensity of his stare. It was too much. If she looked into his eyes for another second, she would do something stupid. She would lean into his touch. She would admit that the hardest part of working in this house wasn't the scrubbing or the cold. It was watching him carry the weight of a violent world all by himself and knowing she couldn't reach out to steady him. Callum felt her withdrawal. He felt the tension stiffen her neck, the way her eyes darted away to avoid his. He didn't let her hide. He slid his fingers down from her cheek, his thumb catching the underside of her chin. The pressure was gentle, completely devoid of the crushing force Frank Russo had used, but it was absolute. He lifted her chin, forcing her head up, forcing her to abandon her retreat and face him in the dim, shadowed light of the room. "Look at me," he commanded softly. It wasn't the voice of a boss giving an order to a maid. It was a plea from a drowning man asking for a lifeline. "Please, Maeve, look at me." Maeve obeyed. She lifted her eyes, her gaze locking onto his. The air between them seemed to thin out, making it hard to breathe. In that single, protracted beat of silence, every unspoken truth in the house rose to the surface. Neither of them could hide their feelings anymore. The debt, the apron, the suits, the bodyguards in the hall, it all peeled away, leaving only two exhausted, scarred people standing in the dark. Recognizing the shared loneliness in each other's eyes, Callum's thumb brushed lightly over her lower lip, his gaze dropping to her mouth before returning to her eyes. He was trembling now, a barely perceptible shudder that ran through his large, powerful frame. "I have spent 14 months trying not to look at you," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rough, ragged whisper. "I told myself you were just a girl working off a ledger. I told myself that keeping you in the kitchen was keeping you safe from this life. But every time I walk into a room, I'm looking for you. Every time I hear footsteps in the hall, I'm waiting for it to be you." Maeve felt a tear break free, sliding warm and wet over her cheekbone, soaking into the rough skin of his thumb. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't care about crying anymore. "This is a mistake, Callum," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You know how this goes. A man like you and a woman like me, we don't get happy endings. We get casualties. I don't care about happy endings, Callum said, stepping closer, his chest pressing lightly against hers. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool air. I just want one thing in this world that isn't poisoned. I want one person who looks at me and sees something worth saving. I can't save you, she whispered, her hands slowly coming up to rest against the hard, wool-covered muscles of his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy pounding of his heart beneath the fabric. I can barely save myself. Then we'll drown together, he said. He closed the remaining distance between them, pressing his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss, nor was it the polished, theatrical romance of the paperback novels. It was desperate, hungry, and heavy with the pent-up grief and tension of 14 long months. Callum kissed her as if she were the only source of oxygen in a burning room, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him, lifting her slightly off the floor so she had no choice but to cling to him. Maeve didn't fight him. Her cynicism, her protective armor, her careful calculations of debt and survival, all of it shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. She tangled her fingers in the short, dark hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, opening her mouth to his, matching his desperation with her own raw, buried hunger. She tasted like salt from her tears. He tasted like rain, scotch, and dark, bitter espresso. It was messy, breathless, and intensely real. When he finally pulled back just enough to look at her, his forehead still resting against hers, both of their chests were heaving, their faces flushed in the amber light. "You're not a debt anymore, Maeve," Callum said, his voice fierce, his hands gripping her waist with a possessive, protective warmth. "The ledger is burned. You hear me? You don't owe me a single damn cent." Maeve looked at him, a sad, knowing smile touching the corners of her bruised lips. "If you burn the ledger, Callum, then why am I still here?" He reached up, brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from her forehead, his eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like tenderness. "Because I'm begging you to stay." The transition from Maid to whatever Maeve was now happened without an announcement, without a formal change of title, but the entire house felt the shift within 24 hours. Callum didn't move her into the master suite. They both knew that doing so openly would put a target on her back so large that every rival captain in New England would aim for it. Instead, he simply stopped allowing her to work. When Maeve walked into the kitchen the next morning, reaching for her black apron, Teresa had quietly taken it out of her hands, her old eyes wide and solemn. "Mr. Callum said you don't scrub no more," the old woman had murmured, glancing nervously toward the security cameras in the corner of the ceiling. "He said your duties are administrative now." "Administrative," Maeve had repeated, a dry, cynical laugh escaping her lips. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Don't joke, girl," Teresa had warned, gripping Maeve's hands tightly. "You crossed the line in the dirt last night. When you walk out of this kitchen now, you ain't staff, you're his. And in this world, property that belongs to the boss is either guarded with rifles or burned to the ground by his enemies. You better pray his rifles are loaded." Maeve had spent the next 3 weeks living in a strange, suspended limbo. She still occupied her small bedroom near the kitchen stairs. She had insisted on that much, refusing to let Callum completely strip away her independence. But her evenings were spent in the study. They never spoke of love. Instead, they built their bond through quiet companionship and honesty. Nora would sit nearby as Callum worked, sharing peaceful evenings over tea and scotch. When the strain of business left him exhausted, she eased the tension from his shoulders with gentle hands. Late at night, after the estate had fallen silent, Callum would come to her room. Without a word, he would set aside his jacket and holster, lie beside her, and hold her close, finding comfort in her presence until morning. "Frank is making moves," Callum said one evening in late autumn. They were sitting on the rug in front of the study fireplace. Maeve was leaning back against his chest, his large arms wrapped securely around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Outside, the first winter sleet was ticking against the window panes. "What kind of moves?" Maeve asked, turning her head slightly to look at his profile. "He bought out 2 of my captains in the South End," Callum said flatly. "Paid off their gambling debts, promised them a bigger cut of the extortion rackets. Paulie told me they held a private sit-down at a restaurant in North Boston yesterday. They didn't invite me." Maeve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. She placed her hand over his, tracing the jagged scar on his forearm. "In my brother's world, when men start holding private meetings without the boss, it means they're shopping for a coffin." "It means war," Callum agreed, his voice low and expressionless. "Frank knows I'm not going to let him dictate terms. He's testing the perimeter, looking for a weakness." He tightened his arms around her waist, his grip becoming almost painful. Maeve understood the unspoken thought hanging between them. He's looking for a weakness. And now I have one. "Send me away," she said, quietly. Callum stiffened, his jaw locked, and he pulled back just enough to force her to turn around and face him. His eyes were dark, flashing with sudden, defensive anger. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Maeve said, meeting his gaze with her chin held high, refusing to let him intimidate her. "If Frank is preparing to hit you, he's going to use whatever leverage he can find. He saw me in the dining room. He knows you threatened him over me. If I stay here, I am a liability to you, and you are a danger to me." "You think I can't protect what's mine?" Callum growled, leaning over her, his presence dominating the space. "I think you're one man against a syndicate, Callum," Maeve shot back, her voice rising, matching his intensity. Her cynical survival instincts were screaming, fighting against the stupid, tender vulnerability that had grown in her chest over the last month. "I am not going to sit here and play the helpless mob wife who gets kidnapped to teach you a lesson. If there's going to be shooting, I want to be in a city where people don't know my name." Callum stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. For a second, she thought he was going to yell, to assert his authority as the boss, and tell her she wasn't allowed to leave. Instead, his shoulders slumped. The anger drains out of his face, replaced by that terrifying, hollow grief that had drawn her to him in the first place. He reached out, taking her face in both of his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "I can't send you away, Maeve," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "If I put you on a train, I'll spend every second of every day wondering if Frank's men are waiting at the station. Here, I have 30 armed men. Here, I have 6 inches of reinforced stone and bulletproof glass. As long as you're in this house, I know you're breathing." "And what if the house isn't safe anymore?" she asked, tears blurring her vision. He leaned forward, pressing a fierce, desperate kiss to her forehead. "Then I'll burn it down with us inside before I let them touch you again." The hit came 3 days later, on a Friday night when the rain had turned into a freezing, blinding storm that cut the power lines along the coastal highway. Maeve was in the kitchen with Teresa, packing cold meats and bread into Tupperware by the light of emergency battery lanterns. Callum was in the basement security center with his 2 primary lieutenants, trying to re-establish radio contact with the outer gatehouses, which had gone silent 15 minutes earlier. The silence was unnatural. Even in a power outage, there should have been the low rumble of the backup generator kicking in. There was only the howling of the wind and the rattling of the kitchen windows. "Teresa," Maeve said, stopping with a knife in her hand. Her chest was tight, every hair on her arms standing on end. "Where is Paulie? He was supposed to be guarding the back door." Teresa looked up from the sink, her wrinkled face pale in the yellow lantern light. She walked slowly to the small window that looked out over the back courtyard, cupping her hands around her eyes to peer into the freezing darkness. "I don't see him," the old woman whispered. Then the kitchen door didn't just open, it exploded inward, the heavy wooden frame splintering as a boot kicked it off its hinges. 3 men in dark parkas and tactical vests flooded into the kitchen, automatic rifles raised. They weren't Callum's men. One of them, a tall man with a scarred cheek, raised his weapon, pointing the barrel straight at Teresa's chest. "Where's Moretti?" he barked. Teresa didn't scream. She reached for the heavy cast iron skillet on the stove, but she was 70 years old and slow. The scarred man didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger once. A silenced thwip-thwip spat from the barrel, and Teresa collapsed backward against the cabinets, sliding down onto the linoleum tiles with 2 dark holes in her apron. "No!" Maeve screamed. She reacted without thinking. Instead of surrendering, Maeve hurled the heavy wooden cutting board at the scarred gunman. It smashed into his face, knocking his aim off just as he raised his rifle. Maeve immediately dove behind the large kitchen island as suppressed gunfire ripped through the stainless steel refrigerator where she had been standing moments earlier. "Get around the counter! Grab the bitch!" the scarred man yelled, holding his bleeding nose. "Frank wants her alive. He wants Moretti to watch." Maeve scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, her heart hammering wildly in her ears. She reached for the drawer where the heavy butcher knives were kept, but heavy boots were already coming around the corner of the island. Suddenly, the swinging doors leading to the formal dining room burst open. Callum stood in the doorway. He had a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun in his hands, his face a mask of absolute primitive fury. He didn't ask questions. He didn't issue commands. He simply raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed kitchen. The man rounding the island took the full charge in the chest, flying backward into the wooden pantry doors, shattering them into splinters. The remaining 2 shooters spun toward Callum, firing wildly. Bullets tore into the doorframe around him, sending showers of wood chips and plaster dust into the air. Callum didn't retreat. He pumped the shotgun, stepped into the line of fire with terrifying indifference to his own life, and fired again, taking the second man down with a shot to the midsection. The scarred man, bleeding heavily from his nose, realized the tactical disadvantage. He dropped his rifle, pulled a heavy semi-automatic pistol from his belt, and lunged across the kitchen counter toward Maeve, his fingers snagging the collar of her shirt, dragging her backward into his chest as a human shield. "Drop it, Moretti!" the man screamed, pressing the hot barrel of the pistol against Maeve's temple. "Drop the gun, or I blow her brains out right here!" Callum froze. The pump action of the shotgun was halfway back. His eyes locked onto Maeve's face. In that split second, Maeve saw the transformation in him, the invincible boss, The cold, tactical genius who controlled a city completely collapsed. His hands shook. The color drained from his face until his skin was the shade of ashes. He looked at the gun pressed against her head, and for the first time since she had known him, Callum Moretti looked terrified. "Okay," Callum rasped, his voice breaking. He slowly lowered the barrel of the shotgun toward the floor. "Okay, easy, take me. Frank wants me. The girl doesn't know anything." "Frank wants both of you," the scarred man sneered, taking a step backward toward the shattered back door, dragging Maeve with him. "Now kick the gun across the floor, or I swear to God I'll spread her over these cabinets." Callum opened his hands. The heavy shotgun clattered onto the blood-slicked linoleum. He raised his hands slowly in the air, his eyes never leaving Maeve's. "Look at me," his eyes seemed to say. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Maeve didn't want his apology. She didn't want to die in this freezing kitchen on a pile of broken glass and Teresa's blood. Her cynicism had taught her one fundamental truth. Nobody saves you in this world. You save yourself, or you bleed out on the floor. As the scarred man shifted his weight to step over the threshold of the broken door, Maeve felt his balance falter for a microsecond on the wet ice blowing in from outside. She didn't hesitate. She didn't pull away from the gun. Instead, she threw her entire body weight backward against his chest, her left hand snapping up to grip his wrist, pushing the barrel of the pistol upward, just as she brought the heel of her right work shoe down with crushing force onto the instep of his foot. The man grunted in pain, his grip on her collar slipping. The gun fired into the ceiling, showering them in plaster. Before he could aim the weapon again, Callum moved. He didn't go for the shotgun on the floor. He crossed the 12 feet between them in two massive, explosive strides, tackling the scarred man through the open doorway out onto the freezing, sleet-covered concrete of the back patio. Maeve fell hard onto the kitchen floor, gasping for breath, her ears ringing from the gunshot. She scrambled to her knees, looking out into the howling storm. Callum and the scarred gunman crashed onto the icy ground, fighting desperately for the pistol. The attacker briefly aimed the weapon at Callum, but Callum slammed his wrist against the concrete until the gun flew into the darkness. Then Callum grabbed the man's throat. Driven by sheer terror rather than technique, he pinned him down and repeatedly slammed his head against the frozen concrete until the struggle ended. For several seconds, Callum remained kneeling over the motionless body, breathing heavily. Blood covered his hands, and his torn white shirt was soaked by the freezing rain. Slowly, he turned his head and looked back through the doorway at Maeve. She was kneeling among the shattered glass and bullet casings, her hands bleeding from where she had scraped them on the floor. She didn't look like a maiden who had just been rescued. She looked like a soldier who had just survived a bombardment. Pale, breathing heavily, her eyes wide and dark with adrenaline. Callum stood up, staggering slightly on the ice. He walked back into the kitchen, stepping over the bodies of the gunmen. He didn't say a word. He dropped to his knees in front of her, reaching out with his blood-soaked hands, pulling her into his chest with a force that knocked the remaining breath out of her lungs. He buried his face in her neck, and for the first time since she had met him, Maeve felt the large, unbreakable boss of the Moretti family begin to shake with violent, silent sobs. They didn't stay at the estate. Within an hour, the surviving guards, led by Dominic, who had fought his way through the front gatehouse to reach the main house, had secured the perimeter and loaded Callum and Maeve into an untraceable, armored SUV. They drove north, away from Boston, away from the coast, deep into the rural, snow-covered hills of Vermont. They ended up at a small, unassuming hunting cabin at the end of a dirt road, a safe house Callum's father had bought 30 years ago under a dummy corporation and never used. There were no servants here, no silver trays, no Persian rugs, just bare pine walls, a wood-burning stove, and a single, lumpy mattress covered in heavy wool blankets. For 3 days, the outside world ceased to exist. They had no phones, no radios, no connection to the war that was undoubtedly raging in the streets of the city. There was only the wood smoke, the freezing wind whistling through the floorboards, and each other. On the 4th night, the storm cleared, leaving the woods outside bathed in the cold silver light of a full moon. Maeve sat on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in a heavy gray sweater that belonged to Callum, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. She was holding a bowl of hot canned soup, watching Callum as he stood by the wood stove, poking at the burning logs with an iron poker. He looked different here. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a faded flannel shirt and dark denim jeans. The 2-day stubble had grown into a short, dark beard that grayed slightly at the chin. Without the armor of his wealth and his title, he looked younger, yet infinitely more tired. A man who had finally put down a weight he had been carrying for 20 years, only to find that his hands were permanently bent from the shape of the burden. "Dominic will be here tomorrow with the transport," Callum said, his voice quiet in the small room. He didn't turn around from the fire. "He says Frank Russo is dead." Maeve stopped her spoon halfway to her mouth. She lowered it back into the bowl. "Who did it?" "Dominic," Callum replied, poking a log until a shower of orange sparks flew up the chimney. "He caught Frank trying to board a private charter out of Logan Airport. He put 3 rounds through the window of his car. The North End captains are already fighting amongst themselves for the scraps. The war is over. We won. We won." The words should have sounded like a victory. Instead, they sounded like an obituary. Maeve set the bowl of soup down on the floor beside the mattress. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. "Teresa is dead." Callum froze, the iron poker hovering over the fire. He slowly lowered it to the hearth and turned around, leaning his lower back against the brickwork of the stove. His slate-gray eyes were dark, filled with a quiet, unresolvable guilt. "I know," he said softly. "I'll make sure her family is taken care of. A trust fund for her grandkids. A full pension." "She didn't care about a pension, Callum," Maeve said, her voice stripped of emotion, flat and realistic. "She cared about breathing. She cared about cooking her roast veal and going home to her cat. You can't buy your way out of a graveyard." Callum winced as if she had struck him. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had strangled a man to death on a freezing concrete patio 4 days ago. "I know," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you, Maeve. Everything I touch turns to blood." He walked over to the mattress and sat down on the floor at her feet, his back resting against the bed frame. He pulled his knees up, mirroring her posture, staring out the small, frost-covered window at the moonlit trees. "Tomorrow, when Dominic gets here, there will be 2 cars, Callum said, without looking at her. "One of them is going back to Boston. I have to go back. I have to clean up the mess Frank left behind, reorganize the captains, make sure the harbor unions don't collapse." He paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply in his throat. "The second car is going west," he continued, his voice tight, strained. "To California or Oregon, wherever you want it to go. There's a briefcase in the trunk with $200,000 in clean, untraceable cash. No leashes, no debts. You get in that car, Maeve, and you never have to look at a man like me again. You never have to smell copper in the laundry room ever again." Maeve stared down at the top of his head. She looked at the dark hair, the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists on his knees. This was the exit. This was the moment every cynical survivalist prayed for. The clean break, the payout, the freedom to walk away from a burning house before the roof collapsed on your head. She had spent 14 months dreaming of the day she could leave the Moretti estate and never look back. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed her fingers on his shoulder. Callum flinched at the contact, turning his head to look up at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, full of a desperate, silent pleading. He was offering her her freedom, but every muscle in his body was screaming for her to refuse it. "You think $200,000 pays for what happened in that kitchen?" Maeve asked quietly. "It pays for a start," he rasped. "It pays for a life where you don't have to check the exits every time you walk into a restaurant." "And what about your life?" she asked, sliding off the mattress to kneel on the cold wood floor beside him. She took his clenched fists in her hands, gently prying his fingers open one by one until his palms lay flat against hers. "Who checks the exits for you when I'm gone? Who tells you when you're acting like a tyrant? Who cleans the blood off your hands when you can't stand the sight of it yourself?" Callum closed his eyes, a shudder running through his entire body. "Don't do this, Maeve. Don't make me be selfish. I am trying to save you from me." "I told you once before, Callum Moretti," she said, leaning in close, her voice steady, stripped of all fairy tale illusions, and replaced by the hard, durable strength of a woman who had chosen her own fate. "Nobody saves me. I save myself." She didn't take the second car. When Dominic pulled the black armored sedans up to the cabin the next morning, the snow was melting off of the pine needles, dripping onto the muddy roof of the porch. Dominic stood by the open rear door of the first sedan, wearing a heavy winter coat, a submachine gun slung discreetly under his arm. He looked at Maeve as she walked out onto the porch behind Callum, carrying a single leather duffel bag. There was no disrespect in Dominic's eyes today. There was no smirking, no lingering glances at her legs or her throat. He looked at her the way he looked at Callum, with the cautious, absolute deference owed to someone who had stood in the middle of a gunfight and come out the other side with blood on their hands and their head held high. "We have a situation at the docks, boss," Dominic said as they approached the car. "The Union delegates are refusing to unload the cargo from the Naples ships until we guarantee their new rates. They're spooked after what happened to Frank." Callum stopped by the car door. He wore his dark suit again, the armor of the boss restored, but the rigid, isolated loneliness that had always surrounded him was gone. He looked at Dominic with cold, clear eyes. "Tell them the rates stay where they are," Callum said flatly. "Tell them Frank Russo is dead because he forgot who built the docks. If they don't want to unload the ships, we'll find men who will. And Dominic?" "Yeah, boss." "If any of them mention my family or what happened at the estate last week, you put them in the harbor." Understood, Dominic nodded. He held the door open wider. Callum didn't get in immediately. He turned to Maeve, who was standing beside him on the wet gravel. The wind was cold, blowing her dark hair across her face. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform anymore. She wore a dark wool coat Callum had bought her from a general store down the road, her chin tucked into a gray scarf. He reached out, his hand coming up to brush the hair away from her eyes. He didn't lift her chin this time. He didn't need to force her to look at him. Her eyes were already locked onto his. Dark, realistic, completely devoid of fear. "We're going back to a graveyard, Maeve," he murmured, his voice low enough that Dominic couldn't hear. "There are going to be more Franks. There are going to be more nights where the power goes out and the guns start going off. This doesn't get easier." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "I can't promise you peace," he continued, his thumb grazing her cheekbone, lingering on the spot where Frank Russo's bruises had finally faded away. "I can only promise you that nobody will ever touch you again without answering to me. And I promise that I will never look through you again. You are my equal in that house. Always." Maeve looked at the armored car, then back at the man who owned it. She didn't smile. A cynic doesn't smile at the beginning of a war. But she reached up, covering his hand with her own, squeezing his fingers with a fierce, reassuring strength. "I don't need peace, Callum," she said simply. "I just need you to keep your eyes open, and the next time there's a stain on the rug, we clean it together." Callum's mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of a real human smile breaking through the heavy gray slate of his expression. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute, mutual understanding. He didn't open the door for her like a servant. He stood aside, letting her step into the back of the armored sedan first, before climbing in beside her and pulling the heavy bulletproof door shut against the cold, gray world outside. As the car pulled away from the cabin, turning south toward the city and the violence waiting for them there, Callum didn't stare out the window at the rain. He sat close to her, his fingers twined tightly with hers on the leather seat, holding on to the only piece of truth he had left in a world built on lies. If Maeve and Callum's journey through the dark underbelly of power and loyalty resonated with you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support more gritty, grounded romance dramas that don't insult your intelligence with fairy tale tropes. Share this video with fellow lovers of intense, slow-burn storytelling, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next audio drama. Leave a comment below. Would you have made the same choice Maeve did, or would you have taken the car to California? Let's talk about it in the comments. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next chapter.